There we go. All right. Christelle?
Hey, thank you, Romeo. So, good evening, everyone. Good evening from Asia and the Pacific, and good morning to our friends in North America. Welcome to our online discussion, Stepping Up for Indigenous Culture and Knowledge. And tonight, we are going to hear the lived experiences of our Indigenous brothers and sisters with regards to the repressive history and character of residential and factory schools that have since targeted the erasure of Indigenous culture. So, my name is Cristel Gawisan, um, uh, Kankanaoy from the Cordilleras, and I am a part of um, the Progressive Igorots for Social Action, which is my organization, and I will be your facilitator for today. So, moving aside, policies of assimilating, mainstreaming, or detribalizing indigenous communities by placing their children in boarding schools have been increasingly discredited and abandoned. Most public, most publicly throughout North America, Canada, Norway, Russia, and Australia since the 1980s and 1990s. In India, this history and its dangers are little known, with relatively little awareness of how they are being replicated among many of India's indigenous communities. Education, or rather formal school-induced assimilation had been evolving slowly and hence invisibly in India. But this has now reached mammoth proportions in the Indian subcontinent, more than in any Asian country. That is why today's discussion is critical for for today, our goal is to deepen our understanding of the establishment of these systems and their lasting impacts on indigenous peoples. And so if our first speaker is ready, our first speaker, we are honored to have Connor Sarazin, a member of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation, and currently works with Kairos, an ecumenical movement for ecological justice and human rights. Connor?
Great. Thank you, Crystal. That was very good. Actually, you did very well on pronouncing my reserve name. So Kwe Mino Pumwazwan, Pajashan, and Ottawa Tibikad, Connor and Indigenous, Nikwaknagan and Dojaba, Makwan and Dodam, Omama Winini, Inini, Nindao. Hello, good morning, good day, wherever you are. Welcome. My name is Listens to the Darkness, and my colonial name is Connor. I am from Pikwakanagan First Nation, as Crystal mentioned, and I am from the Bear Clan, and I'm from the Algonquin peoples, also known as the Downriver people, whose traditional lands are unceded and unsurrendered territory of my people, and that's where I am now. So just a little bit about the history here. So the origins of the residential school system in Canada can be traced back actually to the 1830s, 1831 to be exact. So long before Confederation in Canada, which was in 1867. And while the federal residential school system began around 1883, when the Anglican Church established a residential school in Brantford, right here in Ontario. But prior to that, churches had built schools specifically for our Indigenous children since the mid 1600s by Catholic missionaries with very limited enrollment. So with the church's failed attempts to civilize the savages who had no Christianity connections to come willingly, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were removed against their will from their families, their communities, and put into these so-called schools, where they were forced to abandon all of their traditions, their cultural practices, and most importantly, their language. The residential school system was just one tool in a broader plan of aggressive assimilation and colonization of Indigenous people and territories in Canada. The removal of language and culture also removed us from our lands, our true mother for all beings. The Canadian government and Canada's churches built the residential school system as a means to solve the Indian question in Canada. The perceived threat and barrier posed by Indigenous people to the ongoing construction of the newly forming nation of Canada. Therefore, by stripping the Indigenous people of their children, their language, and ultimately their connection to the lands, these schools were a way, really, for the new settlers to claim land that were traditionally occupied by the Indigenous people. And over the course of history, the school buildings were really miserable places. They were poorly built, poorly maintained. They've had very limited heating and cooling systems in place. And if you've ever visited Canada, it's like minus 21 degrees Celsius here this morning. So it's a little chilly if you don't have any very good heat. And the food was just terrible. And in fact, our national food guide was originally built on the basis of how little food a person needed to survive on, using our Indigenous children as the test subjects. And there was a real lack of supervision and training for all staff. And this created a real situation that left our children prey for sexual and physical abusers from church and school staff. Now, this conversation might make it sound like, ancient history, but in fact, the last residential school didn't close uh, until 1998 in Saskatchewan. And I was 27 at that time. So it's not, sometimes I feel ancient, but it's not ancient history that a lot of these things have happened. So originally, the residential school system focused on industrial labor schools and farm schools. Back in 1931 was the peak when there was about 80 schools in operation. And that might not sound like a lot of schools given the size of Canada. But if you think of the 150,000 plus children that went through these schools, that's a lot of kids. And those kids over the decades ranged anywhere between ages of 4 to 16. And there wasn't really any basic education in these so-called schools. They were there um, to for the kids to learn how to, do industrial work, work in gardens, work in the barns, work in the workshops, work in the sewing rooms. In a lot of instances, it was working to maintain the school. And, one of the darkest elements of the residential schools was how many children disappeared while attending these schools. They would die from disease, abuse, neglect, and occasionally trying to run away. And it would often take weeks or months for parents to even learn that their child had died. In 2021, they call it the discovery of the remains of 215 Indigenous children buried haphazardly outside a former residential school in BC. In fact, I knew growing up that we had relatives somewhere on the lands, where my grandparents had attended residential school. There was no discovery as they tried to spin the narrative for people around the globe. This was a recovery. Everyone across the nation from an Indigenous community knew our relations were scattered and discarded like garbage. And in some cases, many are in mass graves without any marker or acknowledgement of even a being. Our Senator, Murray Sinclair, who's the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, really summarized that situation by saying, they didn't bother to keep track of children who died, and it's completely unacceptable. So some of the documents that have been, I guess, found or released, they were all been hidden and buried somewheres. They really revealed stories of children being locked in school basements for days, being forced to eat their own vomit. And even my own grandfather spoke about being threatened to be thrown into a furnace along with other children if they didn't, if they didn't speak English, if they tried to speak their own language. Staff used, metal fashioned whips for corporal punishment. And one of the most shocking stories comes out from a residential school in Northern Ontario, St. Anne's Residential School. And the survivors there spoke about being put into a homemade electric chair to punish children. And over the years, so there was quite the investigation from that. And the investigation only concluded in 1997 after 5 years. And the teachers and administrators from the school were arrested and eventually convicted after their 5-year investigation for the treatment of children. Now, we use the term survivors to describe the tens of thousands of people who attended residential schools in Canada and lived to talk about it. And we know many never returned. And another reason for this term is to acknowledge the number of students who just never made it home, and to really legitimize the experience of the students while they did have to go to residential schools. The assault was not only on their bodies with the abuse, but their minds, their culture, the language, to the families, and to our whole identity, which really had long-lasting and permanent effects. It took decades, really, for the general public in Canada to recognize these stories as truth and to believe the members of the church were abusing young children in their communities. And in some cases, survivors describe situations where even their own parents did not believe what was occurring in the schools. And in 2017, there were more than 38,000 claims for serious sexual and physical abuse that was received, and more than 80,000 survivors who had a very common experience received a payment for the harm inflicted from the churches and the government. So just like a stone, when you throw it in the water, there's a ripple effect. Children who, were abused physically, emotionally, sexually, they were ripped away from their parents, from their community. In many cases, I mentioned earlier, as young as 4. They don't have that sense of being shown love and how to give love. And when they're taken away, in many instances, they were even segregated from their siblings, so that they wouldn't speak the language. And the whole system was really designed to remove all hope, all connection of family and community. And it's been ongoing for more than 190 years. So the impacts of the residential schools currently leads to a high number of Indigenous children who are currently in our social child welfare system. They're still being taken away from families. Indigenous children only make up about 7.7% of all of Canada's child population, but almost 54% of the children in foster care are Indigenous children. And even still, many hospitals in Canada are mandated to report to child welfare that there's an Indigenous woman there to give birth. So a child welfare worker will go to the hospital and try to remove children right at birth. So all of this is a direct consequence, of centuries of policies of assimilation, structural inadequacies, and complete discrimination that limit resources for First Nation families and communities to thrive. Slowly we're trying to take back control. There's many Indigenous agencies that are now taking over files from mainstream child welfare agencies, my community included. But we still have a lot of work ahead. Working on clean drinking water. Many communities haven't had clean drinking water or haven't been able to drink their water for anywhere from 20 to 30 years. My community itself is probably going on 25 years now that haven't been able to drink the water there. And in many First Nation communities, especially those who are remote, where they need to fly in, there isn't even hydro, where we all take, well, probably a lot of us take for granted. They run on diesel generators. And I'm just going to close this off by saying that I'm a second generation residential school survivor. And why do I say that? My grandparents left their community and hid to raise their children. My parents really didn't know how to still express their love and affection for their kids as a result of not receiving that themselves. So even though I never attended residential school, I still carry some of that pain and heartache of my ancestors through my blood memory. And for them, I opened up with speaking a little bit of the language. So I'm reclaiming who I am, our language, ceremony, and my connection to the land with all beings who walk on this journey with me. So miigwech, thank you.
Thank you for sharing this history, Connor. Connor's statement perhaps lays out fundamental factors in pointing out the dark history of residential and boarding schools. And even just from Connor's statement, we can quickly see how Indigenous peoples are seen to be mere subjects of um, certain colonial educational systems, even when such systems are not applicable or suitable to the objective situations a certain nation is. So to move forward and to give us a different story from the other side of the globe, perhaps. Now, for our next speaker, she will be sharing about the history of generations of Indigenous children taken away from their families in Australia. The policies that have enabled this ethnocide has existed from the 1800s throughout the 1970s and has led countless children being forcibly separated from their families. Such systems are built on racist and oppressive views against Indigenous peoples. So, to tell us more about this, let's hear from Thelma Parker, a traditional owner from Walawara, Wangkayujuru, Wangkayumunha. I hope I read that right. She was raised in bush camps on Kalkadun country, her father's country. Thelma has a deep connection with Catholics and has worked in Catholic education for more than 25 years. And through her collaborative leadership and co-facilitation of the truth-telling program, it has been delivered to more than 10,000 participants. Further, providing the Archbishop of Brisbane the banquet exercise as a direct result of his learnings from the program, the Archbishop publicly endorsed the Uluru Statement, a powerful symbol of the Church's commitment to the Reconciliation Action Plan that calls for solidarity with First Nation peoples. So, Thelma, you can have your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Christella. And very good. I'm actually from Walyawara, Wakagudgeru, Wakamana traditional owner groups, and it's actually more in the centre of Australia for everyone. So what I'd like to do, if I could just share my screen, please, if that's possible.
Let me give you access, Selma.
Okay, thank you. Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
There we go. Can you see it now?
Yes, I can. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Great, fantastic. I'm just going to go to the first one. All right, okay. So today I'll be talking for the next 10 minutes around the stolen generation of Australia, and it's for our First Nations people, which we call today our Aboriginal. And when we talk about Aboriginal, for me, it's about our clan groups. So this is a map of Australia and Tasmania, and then obviously up in the Torres Straits. So where I come from is around this central bit in Queensland. So for us as Aboriginal people, stolen generation has been a part of this process since the 1800s, early as to 1975. It has put a tremendous burden on our people. And this is through, since colonialisation, a number of government laws, policies, and practices, which removed the generations of our younger people. I can still recall my mother and my father. This is our country. They had native police who used to come and take our brown-skinned babies away. The lady that you see on your left or right-hand side is my grandmother, Queen Ida Toby. On the other side is when they were painted up for what we call ceremonial. our babies were either sent to Palm Island, Cherbourg, Warrabinda, or Yarrabah. And the reason what they wanted to do this is to take away our identity. The assimilation policy that the government had put in. This is us back home on country. I was very grateful for my mother, my grandmother, and my uncles to still have really strong language. Language which actually taught us how to survive on country, but also the spirit of what we carry. I am now going to play a video, if I may, and I hope this comes through. If it doesn't, please stop me. When our culture and our culture started to thrive. Wars, disease, famine, violence, and destruction, violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities. Our knowledge, terror, and everything is down to each other and the land. Our children were taken from us. Had their names changed and identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them. Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds. It scars are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively. Since the trauma of colonization and stolen generations, we've not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse. But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong bonds and hurts, and we still know So where are we today here in Australia? The Bringing Them Home report gave extensive evidence of the past practices and policies which resulted in the removal of our children. It also details the conditions into many of our children were placed and discussed the ongoing impact of our trauma, which still runs through our waters today. The Stolen Generation, which is now a National Apology Day. Kevin Rudd, a Labor Prime Minister, had said sorry. Sorry to the forceful removal of our people. Part of this process was our people regain some of the money, but not all of the money. Yes, it is a first step into healing. It also acknowledges the truth of Australia. Our people, the stolen generation. We have become stronger. And given that the colour of our skin we were judged by. So today, we are walking in the footsteps of our greatest giants, our ancestors, who handed down the law, our languages, and our identities. In some cases, our people don't have that. But with the learning and the connectedness to countries, we are making grounds. I'd like to leave with Uncle Rachi Roach, who actually wrote and sung about the Australian stolen generation. Thank you for listening to me tonight, this morning, or this afternoon, no matter where you are in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelma. Perhaps cultural uprootment or being forced to leave our ancestral domains has been a critical part in our recognition and understanding as Indigenous peoples. This can be seen especially in today's day and age where development aggression are pushed through in the hardest way possible. Displacement or forced separation of families is their first step in order to ensure that through their unjust implementation of law, oppressors have access over ancestral lands for their so-called development. But of course, the question remains, for who is this development for? Regardless, all of this gives us every reason to assert that fighting for our rights will always be just. So, from one struggle to another, let's now welcome our next speaker, Sharnya Nayak, from the Indigenous Peoples Land, Life, and Knowledge Collective, or IPLLK, a collective of Indigenous community representatives, academics, social environmental activists, poets, writers, and students, and non-Indigenous solidarity workers from different regions of India. IPLLK has been campaigning to put an end to factory schools in India, which has been used by mining corporations to erase Adivasi indigenous culture and force the indigenous population to become workers for mining companies to profit off. So, Sharanya, you may now unmute your mic.
Yeah, Johar, everyone. I mean, I'm like a last minute entrant, and our speaker, Alice, who's basically from the Rao Indigenous community, is, I think, facing some issues in joining. So that's why I'll just give like a short background on the idea of why we call in India the whole experiment of indigenous children in residential schools as factory schools, while hopefully by then Alice would be able to join. Oh yes, Alice has joined. So I'll just give a short, like 2-minute thing on the idea of factory schools and why we are opposed to it, why at Indigenous Peoples Land Life Knowledge Collective we are opposed to it. And then, Alice will share with you more about what her experiences have been, with the formal education, residential schools, impact of residential schools for children, in mining regions, and how it impacts intergenerational resistance against mining companies. So the idea of factory school basically came from one interaction that we had with, some indigenous leaders who were resisting against a bauxite mine in Orissa, or the eastern part of India where we come from. And, he said, like, these residential schools, and especially he was referring to a private mining funded residential school called Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, which is run by, who we call like an education mafia don called Achyut Samant. And he was referring to that school. That school has about 30,000 children, indigenous children, living in a confined campus in the capital city, in the center of an urban metropolitan city, which is the capital of the state of Odisha on the eastern, coastal region of India. So he was referring to that school, and he said that during my visit to that school, I just felt like, there were like, these factory, farm chicken, or, these factory bred chicken who are bred in a small enclosure, hundreds of poultry chicken. And he said, when I saw those children, they looked like these factory bred broiler chicken. And so from then, and we had a laugh, and he said, yes, these schools are producing, broiler or, clones of farm chicken. And I just felt it was like a factory setting. And so from there on, we got this, reference or this metaphor to refer to to residential schools in India, at least in the eastern region that we are, mainly campaigning in, to call these residential schools as factory schools. And the idea and the resistance to these kind of factory schools came basically from a few of our, personal experiences of how during, an anti-mining resistance, uh, we would see that children, like fathers and grandparents are, attending protests, rallies against the mining companies, against the forced occupation of their territories by mining companies and paramilitary forces. And we would see the children not really attending these protests and rallies. And so when we had conversations with the grandparents and the elders and the parents, so many of them kind of very sadly shared that they felt that their children who started going to these residential schools far away from the village, far away from their communities, their region, their territory, in urban centers, in these residential schools where they can only come home once a year, are gradually getting cut off from why we are fighting for our land. They told us that they feel that their children are losing the connection of with the land, and therefore they do not feel the need to resist or the need to fight back against mining interests, mining companies who are trying to forcibly occupy their lands. And that was when we then started gathering testimonies around what really children have to say. Why are they not participating in resistances against mining? What's happening in these residential schools? What are they being taught there? What's happening? And in the last 5-6 years, we have come to understand that all of this is happening by design. It's not that education in residential schools is qualitatively any better than education in the village schools, or but that was the that was the reason why governments and agents of the corporate mining companies would lure parents, saying that the village school is a bad school, there's no good education here, you send your children to these big residential schools in the big cities, and you will see your children will learn better, will have get better education. But then slowly, from our own testimonies and visits to the schools, and we have Felix and Malvika also here with us in this discussion, who can really add more to what I am just saying. But yeah, so that this was the crux of why Indigenous Peoples Land Life Knowledge Collective has taken a position against residential schools, especially focusing in mining funded residential schools where children from mining resistance communities are being forcefully sent to these residential schools in order to cut the connection that they have with their land and forest and territories, their sacred groves, their deities, so that the next generation does not organize itself to resist and protest against mining companies taking over their lands. So yeah, I hope we can have more discussions around this later. But I would really like to hand over, the time and the opportunity to Alice to share more. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharanya. And I'm really sorry for the delay on my end. There was no electricity, and I could not join sooner. Uh, should I go ahead? Am I audible?
Yes. You're audible, Alice.
Okay. Uh, so, as you must have heard about the residential schools from Sharanya and like how the schools are being run in India currently, not just residential schools like Kalinga Institute, which is like a private institution, but also the government run ashram schools, which are playing a major role in sort of assimilating the indigenous community into the mainstream. And when I say assimilating into mainstream, I mean the idea of mainstream here is a very Hinduized version, where they're imagining the mainstream as dominant caste class, mainly built of dominant caste and class culture. So before getting into the schools, I think I would like to share an anecdote, something that during my masters, I was working on my thesis around Adivasi identity and how schools and educational institutions shape it. And during the discussions with the people who participated uh, in the research, I understood that how the Adivasi identity or the indigenous identity is built through the uh, the culture, which is very much alive through language, through being part of that community, participating in a lot of events, from celebration to praying or even dancing and singing, and how that has shaped a lot of what people, the youth, the Adivasi or indigenous youth now identify themselves with, or how they identify themselves with being an Adivasi. And when you look into these schools, this is exactly what is missing when they try to assimilate us into the mainstream. I remember one of my friend shared during that research that she was performing for a collector, I think, who had arrived in their ashram school. At that time there was some program going on, and by the movement of her feet he recognized that she belonged to a particular tribe, which that person, that collector, also belonged to. And how they sort of like how we identify with certain movements and certain songs within our community, and how we take carry it, which which is something that we associate with, and something that these schools will not understand. To them it is just a cultural event, or to them it's just some form of tribal dance which they don't even know the name of, right? So that is how the youth who were participating in the research were identifying themselves with the form of dance that they have learned within their community during a celebration, or a song that they learned with their grandfather or their father when they were sitting, just sitting and musing. So these things, when we talk about residential schools, like Sharanya was sharing, they do not give us space for something like that, not within the schools. And when we talk about being part of our own communities, being with our communities, they're deprived of that chance as well. If you look at the site of Kalinga, you will see a section called residential model, which very clearly talks about the parameters that they have about residential schools, and how about the residential model and how they explain it, where they talk about language laboratory, they talk about protection from left wing extremism, though they fail to talk about the right wing. Um, they talk about how they break these children from the cycle of poverty and effectively remove these children from the exploitative situations. And there are multiple videos circulating um, about the founder, where he talks about the indigenous or tribal community as primitive tribes. So, despite them working for the tribal people or the indigenous community, they fail to, imagine us beyond primitive, or to put it more bluntly, within their anthropological terms, as backward Hindus, which is exactly how they are, visualizing us, or planning to assimilate us into the Hindu fold. And if I were to talk beyond the Kalinga Institute of Social Science, I have been working in formal education for last 2 years after my masters, in Chhattisgarh, where I work with the government school teachers, and I will not reveal the institution, but here I work with the government school teachers and training the teachers for more, democratic pedagogies, or how they can, use different experiential pedagogies to teach children in school. So I often get to experience how the school functions. And even within these government schools, which are supposed to be institutions where we would expect one to respect all the religion, or not be biased, or at least be secular in the terms that Indian constitution defines secularism, you would often find the assembly itself being biased towards a particular religion, and all the Hindu deities being placed within the school, even especially now when there is, I mean, now the BJP, which is the government in center, has won the election in Chhattisgarh, is has also, using, like, they are entering these education systems even more blunt, without any fear of being questioned, with all sorts of programs, from morning assembly to midday meals to your end of the school. And with a very calculated way of doing it, by removing the chapters from the school textbooks which talk about democracy, which talks about secularism. And uh, and when it comes to indigenous or Adivasi knowledge, it has, it barely exists in these textbooks. um, like, we were talking about language as well, right? So when we say indigenous language, so the national education policy, which recently came out, talks about three language formula. And even in Kalinga, like Sharanya mentioned, they talk about allowing children to, um, uh, like, basically they state that they have included indigenous knowledge or language in their curriculum. um, Similar to what the national education policy says, that, they, in the three language formula, they talk about using the home language or mother tongue, or the local languages, and then they would have Hindi or English being used in the classroom. But it does not define this mother tongue or the language locally used, right? uh, Even in the policy. And when you come on ground, within Chhattisgarh, if I were to speak, there are government books, like the books that are used in the schools, do have tribal language in it, right? The Adivasi language is there, not in script, but it is there. But the teachers are not trained or equipped to even teach that language, or they do not come from that particular community to, provide that sort of context to the children. And even if somehow those stories are used in the classroom, the teachers, those stories itself are not part of the community. They are simple translation from a Hindi story to that particular language. So in that sense, we have deprived the Adivasis, or the indigenous students or children, of the language, the culture, and the kind of knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation. um, we like, recently I was having this discussion with my sister about how we ourselves struggle to talk in our own language, like because we had studied in a convent school, and at some point or the other we were deprived of that language within you know within the school, of course, and outside the school as well, where we were expected to learn English or expected to learn Hindi. I can't imagine how children, and still yet, because our parents used to speak it sometimes at home, or we would participate in a lot of community celebrations where we would hear our aunties or uncles sing songs in our own language. We were able to listen to it, and even though we hesitate a lot, at least over a period of time, we are trying to learn to speak fluently in it. And when I say speak fluently in it, be able to think in that language as well, which is something that I see the students struggling when I often visit these schools, government schools. And to mention that I'm placed in a location which is essentially a tribal block, as per the government, right? So I would often meet students who won't even recognize their own tribe, or when I would mention about their particular tribe's language, they won't even know if this is a language. So the situation is that bad. So I can't imagine the kind of disconnect that a student might feel, or that child might feel, once placed back into that community, which Sharanya was talking about, right? When they come back from these schools or these sort of structures or models, they are not able to connect at all with the kind of context their grandparents or parents have lived through, be it the defined poverty that the mainstream education talks about, uh, which essentially is not being able to meet the dominant caste and class to a certain extent, or be it the language gap, uh, which makes it difficult for them to even connect, even if they want to connect with their um, parents or the community itself. And that is definitely one of the reasons why, as a community, we struggle to protect our land or language or knowledge which is being exploited over and over again. And not just in terms of land, but also in terms of knowledge when it comes to medicinal practices, which is easily being exploited by these ayurveda I mean, all these babas who talk about ayurvedas. So it's on many fronts, and it's very well hidden within the curriculum itself, uh, in a school system. And government schools are supposed to be those places, at least, which would provide opportunities for children to at least have these free education, and also talk about democracy and secularism, and expecting those spaces to be unbiased, be it religion, caste, or class. But instead of providing those spaces, the government has very well indulged itself in the discourse where it says that, okay, government schools are bad, and private schools are the better option, and closing the government schools. I think there was a report in Survival International. I think you must have, some of you must have heard of that organization as well, where it talks about closing a lot of government schools in Odisha, um, and rather promoting Kalinga Institute of Social Science for students to rather go to that private school, and at the same time closing like a lot of government schools within that area. So these, I mean, it's no different than how it used to be, pre-independence, where uh, we would see missionaries entering into adivasi areas or indigenous areas, and proclaiming to provide them with an education which somehow uplifts them of their social class, or of them being primitive or backward. They have just transformed that terminology into, sort of redefined it into backward Hindus, by saying that we are already part of the Hindu fold, and we are just somehow economically or socially backward, or have different practices of praying to the same gods that they pray to. And that way they have assimilated our deities and our ways of belief and knowledge within their own folds, and now, sort of giving back to our communities or to our children by changing the language itself, right? So I think for now I'll share this much, and then we can, participate in the discussion and add more points.
Okay, thank you, Sharanya and Alice, for enlightening us. And also, I would like to thank Evangelina for also clarifying some terms that come alongside their statements in the chat box. So, from India's experience, I must say that the system is really not designed for us, but instead for these companies. Pro-corporate government policies evict indigenous peoples to poverty, forcing especially the parents of these children to be eager to be able to provide formal education to their children. However, residential schools are certainly not the answer to this, especially when these educational systems do not enable us and our children to see and fight against this deep-rooted prejudice when our land and culture are about to be taken from us. And actually, from a reference I read, which is co-authored by Felix over here, I think he is here. So I read one of their articles, and it mentioned that um children of Kurdish descent in Turkey and Tibetans and Uyghurs in China are fully aware of the brainwashing and indoctrination that occurs in schools. The systematic brainwashing and mistreatment of indigenous children in West Papua and other parts of Indonesia are less well known. However, a network of schools managed by indigenous peoples is beginning to change the systematic racism there. So from here, I would like to welcome um a good friend of mine, which is also from the Philippines, and she is Kat Kat Dalon, a Lumad youth, and the current chair of Sabukahan, Unity of Lumad Women and LGBT, and a member of the Ubo Manobo tribe of the Lumad people in Mindanao, Philippines. The Lumads have long been struggling for the right to education and have fought for this through various means, including the establishment of their own community-led schools. The government's anti-insurgency campaign has constantly targeted these schools and have branded them as training grounds for communist rebels. And under the previous administration, which is the Duterte regime, the Philippine government has ordered to shut down all Lumad schools and have robbed the Lumad youth of their basic rights. At present, the Lumads continue to fight for this right. And so, Kat, you can do it.
Hello everyone. Hello Romeo. Pwede pa share yung screen na yung PowerPoint.
Okay, I'll be sharing Cat's screen for everyone to see.
Ban yeah. Wait.
Can you?
Hello. So I'll sharing about this nationalist scientific mass-oriented education in Lumad School. Next slide. Lumad is a collective term for indigenous groups in Mindanao, and there were 18 major ethno-linguistic groups, which include the Ata, Bagobo, Blaan, Bukidnon or Taglaandig, Mandaya, Manobo, and so many. And all these are composed for other sub-tribes I, for one, I'm part of Manobo, and my sub-tribe is the Obo Manobo. While our languages and traditions are different, our elders and leaders united in a collective Lumad identity against the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. So, next slide. Yeah. Social services have long eluded our communities. This goes especially for health and education. We do not experience the enjoyment of our rights as Lumad youth and as citizens. We have been denied these rights. Next slide. This is why we form our own Lumad schools. Our Lumad schools, which respond to the needs of our community, are beyond compare. Our schools are held together by three pillars. First is health, where from grade 7, students receive training on health practices. Students know how to perform checkups, tooth extraction, circumcisions, and for many, even cyst removals. And of course, we are also taught how to make medicine out of medical plants from our surroundings. All these were we are able to apply to our communities. And second is agriculture. For us, Lumad, land is life. So identity, our culture, sustenance, and livelihood come from the land. And yeah, you cannot ever part a Lumad from the ancestral land. Because of this, we farm and plant corn, rice, and vegetables within our schools alongside a fish pond. We farm using organic fertilizers, and we study how to revitalize land ruined by the mining and industrial plantations. Because we need to have food security, and to achieve this, agriculture needs to be sustainable. Third is academic. We study English, math, science, Filipino, and other subjects. English is not part of the culture of our communities, but it is necessary for us to learn the language because the mining contract and other documents that can be used against us are written in English. Even the law that is supposedly protecting the rights of indigenous peoples is written in foreign language. Literacy is one of our many ways to push back and fight in defense of our ancestral land. So, Lumad School, for us, Lumad School are our highest form of resistance to defend our ancestral land, our life. Next slide. So, the form of education in the Lumad schools is nationalist, scientific, and math-oriented. The theories and practices integrated in our curriculum come from our own communities as well. It is math-oriented because it is primarily serves the indigenous youth and the other children of landless farmers in Mindanao. Our curriculum was designed to meet the needs of our community. Um, after our classes, we go back to our communities to serve and give back. And it is nationalist because we are taught to defend our ancestral lands against foreign domination and corporate exploitation. Lastly, it is scientific because we are taught to do concrete analysis based on concrete conditions. Our ABCs are not centered on example like apples, broccoli, and so on because these are things that do not exist in our communities. Instead, we are taught of what is readily accessible to us and what is concretely around us. We also have collective farming wherein everyone contributes for the benefit of everyone as well. So, next slide. Yeah, collective farming. Next slide. So, um, the attack on Lumad School. Militarization has been a major cause of the erasure of our culture. Military forces have banned us from having gatherings, and as indigenous peoples, our gatherings are important because this enables us to talk about politics, culture, and economy, concerns the plug of our community. They have banned us from dancing. Our cultural practices, like these are manifestation of our struggles to defend our ancestral land. It even came to a point where they banned us from wearing our culture accessible because they say it is terrorism. So attacks on our communities have been severe, no, even during the Aquino administration, but they have only grown worsened, no, during the Duterte regime, the former president of the Philippines, and then until now, no. In 2017, Duterte threatened to bomb us after he saw na State of the Nation approach, and he bombed several communities of the Lumad. Many of us were forced to evacuate and leave our homes because of this. Evacuating is difficult. No? We are forced to adjust to our conditions and surroundings wherever we are displaced. There is no water sometimes, and other times not enough food. There have been many incidents where mothers and newborns die from the exhaustions that evacuation brings. But even then, our refuges remain unsafe. So, and it's because the military comes right within our communities and school. No, the militaries are violent. There have been several incidents of torture, even of children. Some play dead while they burn, then escape only to be chased. Until now, the burns appear fresh on their bodies. No? Even there are laws prohibiting armed forces encamping in communities and public infrastructures. The military continue these practices in our Lumad schools. Because of this, too many students remain unable to study, hunted by the trauma brought by the violence of the military. So, next slide. They have contributed not even a peso to our communities, and yet they have the gall to brag about destroying our hard-built schools. So there are 216 Lumad schools in Mindanao, and all of these remain closed amid the pandemic because of the Department of Education denied permits despite complete requirements. That is because of the Executive Order number 70. The whole of the nation approach, where all government agencies, including the DepEd, then National Commission, and including the Department of Education, National Commission and Indigenous People, and Armed Forces of the Philippines, conspire to destroy our communities. They claim to go after terrorists, but we have become their primarily target. The red tagging of our teachers and our organizations, volunteers are beyond bad. Sir Chad and Sir Chad, a teacher, was among those killed in the New Batan 5 massacre last February 24, 2022, where two teachers, one community health worker, and two drivers were slaughtered. Red tagging is used to justify the killing of our um, teachers and other activists. So, Obelio Bayao is a Lumad student in Salugpungan. It's a Lumad school also, and the there is Lianga Massacre one where they massacred the executive director of Alcadep Lumad school also, and the two community leader in front of their community, in front of their family. And then the Lianga Massacre too, Lenny Rivas, a lesbian, um, the family said that the military rape, no, sorry, trigger warning, they rape Lenny Rivas. And then there are students in Lumad communities, and Jun Marcacto killed by the military, and then this is their Chad, and then Sir Jorain. Next slide. So, but why are killings and attacks on Lumad are so intensified? No? If you look back at history, the reason why Lumad schools have become the highest form of resistance It's because our parents can no longer be cheated out of our land. In my experience, 100 hectares of land, imagine how vast that is, no? Would be taken in exchange for a mere few cans of sardines and rolls of tobacco. They made our parents sign papers that they couldn't read. No? This is why they can no longer do. This is what they can no longer do, which is why they resort to human rights violation in our communities. This is next slide. This is motivated largely by big mining companies and that corrupt our land, kill our people. The Pantaran Range is the heart of all Mindanao. The operation hence affect not only one community but the whole of Mindanao. What's more, the largest rivers come from Pantaron Range, including the Davao River, Pulang, and the Pulang River, and many others. Second is the vast plantations. These crops aren't what we need, no, but they are planting palm oil, pineapple, and banana. So in the end, these are what sold in our lands. Next slide. So third is lagging. No, the struggle against the Alcantara and Sons logging company was won by the Manobo in Pantaro. No? So we had a pangayaw to defend the Pantaron in which we triumphed. No? There are also dams, the electric power drawn from them not benefiting the Lumad, no? But rather the large mining corporations and plantations. We study in Bakwit school. We may so that's why we evacuate. No? We study in Bakwit school. We may move from place to place, but our education moves forward from just the same. So, in Bakwit school, next slide. In Bakwit school, no, in Bakwit school, we farm to prove to ourselves that we are not apart from our ancestral lands and hoping that we will be back home someday, soon. And then in Bakwit school, we do checkups, no, we study what we study in Lumad school. So, Bakwit school also is highest form one of our highest form of our resistance because we tell story as I do now. For us, sharing story is also form of therapy. We join protest because there are also avenues to let people know how we are and what we fight for. So yeah, we are inviting people to hear our stories, to join with us. So yeah, and when our teachers and classmates are being killed, we feel afraid too because they can also kill us. It's not true that we are unafraid, that not true that we are untiring, but whenever we reach this low point, we recall why we struggle. We have much more dreams we need to fulfill, many more Lumad schools to forge and open, and much justice to attain. This is why we struggle. We know that there is something greater than our fears, the life of the next generation, our ancestral lands, and then this is why we move forward. So yeah, it is not for us. It is not. It's not. It takes a village to raise a child. For us, it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a movement to build a school. So this is why I challenge all of you here. Join us. Join us. We call and move for justice. Please free to leave questions and to be answered later. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kat. So, thank you for sharing the Lumen's experience in building a network of schools run by Indigenous people. So, I like what Kat said by the end of her speech, where if it takes a village to raise a child, particularly for us Indigenous peoples, it takes a movement to build schools within for our Indigenous community. And so, although it remains a struggle to ensure that these Indigenous run schools are maximized, I hope that their experiences, everyone's experiences across the globe, gives us aspirations and even more courage that in the face of threats and concerns regarding our land, life, and culture as Indigenous peoples, um, we should always go back to the reasons as to why we started to resist, as to why we must struggle, and we shall overcome and be able to preserve our roots. Schools, of course, play a
Ha?
pivotal role in shaping
Kanin?
our society.
Dapat 8:40 lang.
Cut. So there, that's a wrap for our speakers, and for sure, hearing their statements have sparked curiosity. So, by now, I would like to open the floor for questions, and perhaps our speakers can answer them for us. We can leave our questions in the chat, or we can send a direct message to Romeo. Okay, for the first question from our audience, I will read the question, and anyone who would like to answer, they can raise their hand through the icons over the Zoom. So the question is, how do we challenge the school systems that seek to erase our Indigenous culture? What can communities do to defend our cultural life and knowledge? I will repeat the questions again. The question. How do we challenge the school systems that seek to erase our Indigenous culture? And what can communities do to defend our culture, life, and knowledge? Anyone who would like to answer? I think I would like to hear from where? I think I would like to hear from I liked what she said earlier during her speech, particularly where Alice or Sharanya from India.
Alice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that our people are doing, and also, I mean, we should be doing, is reviving the indigenous schools that we already had within our communities. Like within the tribe that I belong, the Kuduk community, where we had Dhumkuriyas, and in Gond community there is Gotul. So there are people who are still, trying to run those Gotuls, and during this assimilation and in last few decades there had been a lot of cultural genocide that has taken place, which led to burning of lot of these schools out of fear of what happens or the lack of understanding on these schools. So I think reviving these schools that we already had within our communities would be a good start to actually, and there are people who are working on it, um, where these schools play a huge role in learning about the community, about the deities, about the songs, about the the cultural celebrations that take place within that particular tribe, or what time or how things are important to that particular community in relation to the land and nature. So reviving these schools, which have already been part of the community for a long time, would be a good start.
Thank you so much for that, Alice. Anyone else who would like to share their answer or their perspective regarding the question? Okay,
Yeah,
Connor.
I can jump in here. Yeah, sure. Um, for us, a lot of communities have already started having schools right on reserve. But there's quite a number of issues with that because, especially for the northern communities, you can only go up like through elementary school, and once high school, um, that age comes to begin high school, now they have to relocate out of the community into a larger city center, which comes with its own challenges of culture shock and again being away from their families. So we're kind of back to the same where um, kids aren't home only once a year during the summer, um, and potentially during a like the Christmas break or whatever. But I think it goes beyond even the schools within communities. Teaching our children culture, I think it needs to go out to, I know the word's been used quite a number of times today, mainstream. So in the colonial education system itself, I think educating settlers needs to be a part of that discussion as well.
Thank you, Connor. And I saw from our chat box that Alice would like to add something more.
Yeah, I just remembered when Connor was sharing about how there is a disconnect, and there's this gap, especially with the youth, right? So something that I have been with the collective that I'm part of, Adivasi Collective, and other youths as well. We have been trying to form a reading group. So stories were a form of, a method of sharing knowledge within the community. In any indigenous community, I think it's a part of sharing community knowledge through songs, through stories. So being able to, form these spaces where we can share our experience through poems or through readings can be a way of negotiating spaces, the current spaces that we already have, in bringing back that consciousness, especially in youth who have been detached from their communities or their identities. And I mean, that has played a I think a pivotal role in my life, at least in last few years, where I have also, not just learning about my identity, but also entering these spaces where we are resisting against these corporates and the dominant communities. So I feel that creating these spaces where we are able to like, creating these spaces or negotiating these spaces, be it through social media platforms or be it face-to-face meetings where we are sharing stories, or these creative ways of sharing knowledge, are definitely one way of going about in the current system where we struggle to place our knowledge within the dominant schools.
I think that perfectly sums up how even within our communities we can challenge this school system that seek to erase our indigenous culture. So for one last time, does anybody want to add to the question?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, so Kat has an answer to the question, which I will translate for her. So I'm just gonna translate it on the spot. So yeah. As Kat was saying, here in the Philippines, before the Department of Education had any semblance of indigenous education, in their curriculum in the public school system facilitated by the government. The Department of Education got their ideas and practices from the Lumad schools themselves. And Kat is also saying that we really need to continue in struggling for our right to proper education and truly progressive education, uh, given the experience of the Lumad schools, which proves that we can actually build our own schools, we can actually establish our own schools that meet the needs of our communities and indigenous peoples. She's also saying that collective struggle is part of the culture of indigenous peoples here in the Philippines, and the culture of collective struggle is one of the main reasons why uh, indigenous culture is able to persevere amidst the countless attacks or cultural offensives, political offensives carried out by the state here in the Philippines. Uh, because our defense of our indigenous culture, in essence, is also being done in part as defense of our ancestral lands. That's why we need to link arms with other groups and other sectors who are also struggling for their rights.
All right. Thank you, Kat, for that answer. And I think it is a perfect summary of how collective struggle can help us in addressing our concerns, particularly in our struggle for our land, life, and resources. And by collective struggle, I would also like to emphasize on our efforts in building international solidarity as through these networks, through this solidarity, we are able to see how our cases are not just isolated cases, but instead it truly is a systematic um problem all across the globe. And we can only see the end of this if we struggle collectively, regardless of our nations. Sachin Shodhari is raising their hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, you can be heard.
Okay, so I just wanted to add one more thing. In this collective struggle, actually, I'm from India, from Maharashtra. So I've been gone through different parts in Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and Assam. So I understand one thing. We should have a this discussions, maybe conference can be one part of collective struggle, but we can also reach out to the people where we can continuous having engagement about our issues, right? That will be a I mean better way to resist collectively and try to find out solutions for our struggle. Yeah.
Thank you, Sachin. And he is right. Beyond conferences, beyond Zoom meetings, there is more work to do outside of our homes, within our communities. And what more can we add to this conversation but to keep learning about our struggles, keep learning about our situations, and from there we can learn so much more and bear fruit so much more. So with that, I think that our conference Stepping Up for Indigenous Culture and Knowledge comes to an end. Perhaps it is about close to midnight in Australia, and by 9 a.m. in Canada. So a good day and a good night to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
Hope we can have more such conversations, to get
Hopefully, hope.
deeper into the different layers of, what everyone really shared about their own experiences.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. For sure, this is not the first and last of our learning sessions. Hopefully, we can do this more of these collective learning sessions, so we can hear more stories and more narratives of struggles and, of course, victories as well of indigenous communities. So when we organize another one, Sharanya, Connor, and of course our friends from Australia, we're talking about continuing this. So yeah, this is not gonna be the last time.
Yes, thank you, Connor, Thelma, and Romeo, and everyone.
Yes, yes. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you to Kairos. Thank you to Thelma, of course, IPLLK, IPMSDL, our friends from the Asia Young Indigenous Peoples for helping us facilitate this. And of course, our friends from Mindanao. Thank you, everyone. Good night from the
Thank you.
Philippines. Good night,
Bye.
Australia.
Good
And
night.
have a great day, Connor. Still a long day
Thank you
ahead.
very much. Absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye,
Great to see you
Connor.
All
again,
right.
Thelma.
Goodbye.